In a land where the horizon often trembled with the dust of distant gunfire and the cries of a weary nation, there emerged a leader unlike any other. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose journey from a soldier to the protector of a fractured people would be etched in the history books for generations to come. Ibrahim was born in a small village on the edge of the vast Sahel Desert. Raised by a father who was a farmer and a mother who was a teacher, Ibrahim understood the value of hard work, wisdom, and resilience. But as he grew older, he witnessed the growing unrest that spread across his beloved country. The desert winds carried whispers of insurgents creeping ever closer to their borders, and the people who once lived in harmony were now divided, torn apart by fear and distrust. As a young man, Ibrahim enlisted in the military, hoping to protect his homeland from the unseen enemy that threatened its peace. He trained diligently, rising through the ranks with a quiet determination. Unlike the leaders he had once admired, Ibrahim never desired the trappings of power. His loyalty lay with his country and his people. But as the years passed, he began to realize that the leadership he had trusted was failing them. The military's top brass had grown distant, out of touch with the struggles on the ground. The insurgents grew bolder, and the government's response was fragmented, ineffective. One fateful night, the situation became unbearable. The capital, once a bustling symbol of hope, had descended into chaos. The president and his generals were preoccupied with their own agendas, leaving the people to suffer. A wave of despair washed over Ibrahim, and in the shadows of his military barracks, he began to question everything he had been taught about loyalty, duty, and leadership. It was then that he gathered a small group of trusted comrades. They were not seeking power for its own sake. They sought justice for the people who had been forgotten. "We are not just soldiers," Ibrahim said in a low, determined voice. "We are the last line of defense for our people. If we do nothing, who will protect them?" The decision was made. Under the cover of darkness, Ibrahim and his group launched a swift, calculated coup. They moved through the city with precision, taking key military installations and communication centers. When dawn broke over the horizon, Ibrahim stood at the steps of the presidential palace, his face grim, his eyes burning with a fire that could not be quenched. "We are the guardians now," he declared, his voice echoing across the nation. "The people will no longer be abandoned. We will fight for them, for our families, for our future." The world watched as the young leader stepped into power, his military background giving him the expertise to make quick, strategic decisions. But it was his deep connection to the people, his understanding of their suffering, that made him different from his predecessors. Ibrahim was not just a commander, he was a protector, a man who understood that true leadership was born from empathy and action. Under Ibrahim's rule, Burkina Faso underwent a transformation. His first priority was security, but he also knew that security meant more than just military victories. It meant rebuilding trust between the people and the government, restoring their belief that they could thrive despite the odds. Ibrahim established local councils, bringing communities into the decision-making process. He listened to their grievances, their hopes, and their dreams. The insurgents, once emboldened by the chaos, found themselves facing a government that no longer operated from the shadows, but from the heart of its people. But leadership in such turbulent times was not without sacrifice. Ibrahim faced internal opposition from those who still clung to the old ways of doing things. There were those who doubted his vision, who feared that a leader with military roots could never truly be a servant of the people. And in the shadows, forces from beyond the borders began to stir, eager to exploit the country's fragile state. Yet Ibrahim remained resolute. With every challenge, he grew stronger. his resolve harder. His name, once whispered in quiet corners, became a symbol of hope, a symbol of a nation that would rise from the ashes of conflict and rebuild itself. The winds of change had begun to blow, and with Ibrahim Traoré at the helm, they no longer carried the scent of fear but of a new dawn. And so, the protector became not just the leader of a country, but a beacon to all those who believed that even in the darkest of times, the light of hope could still shine through. As the weeks turned into months, Ibrahim Traoré faced the monumental task of stabilizing a country fractured by years of insurgency, political turmoil, and deep mistrust between the government and its people. The weight of his decisions often pressed heavily on his shoulders, but his conviction never wavered. He had come to power with a singular vision: to restore Burkina Faso's dignity, to give its citizens the safety they desperately needed, and to remind them that they were not abandoned, not forgotten. However, peace is never easily won, and in the rugged hills of the Sahel, the enemy was ever present. The insurgents, emboldened by the instability, had become more organized and brutal. Yet, Ibrahim knew that defeating them wasn't solely a matter of military might. It required uniting a divided nation. His first order of business was to reshape the country's military strategy and refocus its objectives. No longer would the army fight a faceless enemy in isolated regions. It would instead engage with the heart of the problem, an entire nation, torn apart by fear, distrust, and despair. To accomplish this, Ibrahim reformed the military leadership. He brought in younger officers, men and women who had experienced the horrors of insurgency firsthand and who understood the needs of the local communities. He implemented grassroots approaches, working with village leaders and elders to create local militias who could defend their own homes, turning the war for survival into a war for unity. This not only alleviated pressure on the overstretched central forces, but also gave the people a sense of agency over their own fate. Ibrahim's policies were not limited to military reform. He took decisive steps to restore the country's infrastructure. Roads, schools, and hospitals, all of which had fallen into disrepair, were rebuilt. The government's presence in rural areas became a symbol of hope, something the insurgents could not replicate. Every school reopened, and education was offered to the children of soldiers, farmers, and victims of the violence. With each rebuilt structure, Ibrahim was laying down the foundation of a new Burkina Faso that would rise from the ashes, not just survive, but thrive. But Ibrahim was not without his enemies. Within his ranks, there were those who questioned his methods, who believed that to defeat the insurgents, they needed to rely more on traditional military strength. External pressures mounted as well, with neighboring countries and international powers watching closely, some uncertain about his leadership. The old ways of military dictatorships loomed over him like a shadow, and the temptation to use more forceful measures was ever present. Yet, Ibrahim resisted. One evening, as Ibrahim walked through the bustling streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, he encountered a group of children playing a game of soccer. Their laughter filled the air, a sound that seemed out of place in a city still recovering from years of violence. A young boy kicked the ball toward him, and Ibrahim, smiling, passed it back. The boy ran after it, shouting, "The protector plays soccer!" The simplicity of the moment struck Ibrahim deeply, reminding him why he fought. He had made a promise to the people of Burkina Faso, a promise that their children would no longer grow up in fear, that their future would not be dictated by the conflicts of their past. But that future was still uncertain. Every step he took forward was met with new challenges. The insurgents adapted quickly, striking at villages when least expected. And even within his own ranks, rumors of dissent began to rise. Some questioned whether Ibrahim's leadership could hold the fragile alliance of military, government, and people together. But Ibrahim, ever resolute, faced these challenges head-on. He addressed the nation, not from a podium, but from the heart of a village that had been recently attacked. His words were simple but powerful. "We are not just fighting to survive. We are fighting for a future where our children will no longer know the taste of fear. We will rebuild this country together, and together we will defeat those who seek to destroy us." His speech resonated across the nation. Even those who had once doubted him felt a renewed sense of hope. In the heart of the people, Ibrahim found his greatest strength. The country's heart beat in unison with his own. As the months turned into years, the tide slowly began to turn. The insurgents, once so powerful, now found themselves constantly on the defensive. With each victory, both military and cultural, the people of Burkina Faso began to reclaim their land. Ibrahim's reforms were not just political, they were the lifeblood of a nation finding its soul again. Farmers returned to their fields, teachers to their classrooms, and traders to their markets. But Ibrahim knew that peace was still fragile. The forces that had once torn the country apart were still lurking in the shadows. There would always be a need for vigilance. But the seed of hope had been planted, and the people of Burkina Faso, guided by their protector, were ready to nurture it. In the quiet of his office late one night, Ibrahim looked out over the capital. The streets were alive with the bustle of the people, mothers, fathers, and children, all going about their lives with a sense of purpose and optimism that hadn't been seen in years. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Ibrahim allowed himself to believe that the impossible might be within reach. His fight had never been for power. It had been for peace, for a future where Burkina Faso could stand tall again. As he turned away from the window, a sense of peace washed over him. The work was not done, but with each passing day, they were one step closer to the dawn of a new era. And with that thought, Ibrahim Traoré, the protector, knew that his journey had only just begun. The years after Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power were marked by gradual but undeniable progress. The insurgents, though still present in certain areas, were weakening under the relentless pressure from both the Burkinabe military and the newly formed local militias. Ibrahim's reforms had transformed the military and restored a sense of order to the country's social fabric. Yet, even as peace appeared to be on the horizon, there was a growing tension in the air, one that could not be ignored. International attention on Burkina Faso increased. While many nations were cautiously optimistic about Ibrahim's leadership, some remained skeptical. Western powers and regional neighbors expressed concerns about his military background and questioned his intentions for the country's long-term democratic future. Calls for a return to civilian governance were growing louder, especially from factions within Burkina Faso that believed military rule had overstayed its welcome. Internally, Ibrahim faced the challenge of balancing the expectations of the people with the need for a stable, sustainable government. The local councils and community leaders that he had empowered now looked to him for more than just military success. They wanted assurances that the country would eventually transition to a civilian government. They feared that Ibrahim, like many before him, might be tempted to hold on to power indefinitely under the guise of stability. One afternoon, Ibrahim stood in the quiet of his office, deep in thought. His advisors had warned him of the growing unrest among political leaders and members of the military who sought more radical solutions. Some of his own closest allies had even started to question his approach, urging him to take more decisive, authoritarian action. A knock on the door broke his reverie. It was Amina, his trusted minister of social development, who had been with him from the beginning of his journey. Her presence had always been a source of balance for Ibrahim, as she was deeply connected to the people and understood their concerns. "Ibrahim," she said gently, her voice filled with concern, The situation is becoming more fragile by the day. There are murmurs of discontent within the ranks, and the international community is pressing for a clear roadmap to civilian rule. If we don't act quickly, we risk losing the trust we've worked so hard to earn. Ibrahim sighed deeply. His gaze drifted out of the window, toward the rising sun casting its golden light over Ouagadougou. He knew that the time for decisive action had come, but the path forward was not clear. "I know, Amina," he said softly. "But what do we do? We've fought so hard to rebuild this country. If I give in to those calling for a quick transition, will we lose everything we've worked for?" Amina paused, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Ibrahim, the people have followed you because they believe in you. They trust you not because of your power, but because of your vision. You've shown them what is possible: peace, stability, hope. If you are to lead them through this next phase, you must give them a choice. Show them that the future is in their hands, not in the hands of the few." Ibrahim nodded. Amina was right. The people of Burkina Faso had given him their trust, and he had promised them a future built on unity, not fear. Now it was time to honor that promise. He had always believed that leadership was about service, and the next step in his service would be to hand power back to the people. Ibrahim called for a national address. The night before, as he sat alone in his quarters, he reflected on the gravity of the moment. Tomorrow, he would announce a plan for the peaceful transition of power, an unprecedented move in a country long accustomed to coups and military rule. The next morning, as the sun rose over the capital, Ibrahim stood before a crowd of thousands, his face serious yet resolute. The people gathered in the square, sensing the importance of the moment. Cameras from around the world captured his every word. "Fellow citizens of Burkina Faso," Ibrahim began, his voice firm but full of emotion, "you have entrusted me with the leadership of our nation in its darkest hour. Together, we have fought against the insurgents, against fear, against despair. We have restored peace and rebuilt our nation. But we are not done. The work of the people cannot be done by a single person. It is time for us to move toward a new era." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "It is time for Burkina Faso to transition to civilian rule. I will step down, and we will hold free and fair elections. The people will choose their leaders, as it should always be. The military will play its role in keeping the peace. But we must now give the people the power to shape their future." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed surprise, others uncertainty, but there was a quiet respect in the air. Ibrahim's decision was bold, and it sent a powerful message to the nation and to the world. Burkina Faso was ready to chart its own course. "We will not forget the lessons of the past," Ibrahim continued. "But we must now trust in each other. Trust in the future we will build together. I am proud of what we have accomplished, and I am confident that the future of Burkina Faso will be one of prosperity, justice, and peace." The crowd erupted into applause, not for Ibrahim's power, but for the courage he had shown in relinquishing it. His words echoed through the streets, a clear signal to his nation and to the international community that Burkina Faso was taking control of its own destiny. Months passed, and the country prepared for elections. The people, empowered by Ibrahim's act of selflessness, began to take ownership of their future. Political parties, once silenced by fear and repression, began to flourish. Debate and discussion filled the streets as citizens exercised their newfound freedoms. Ibrahim, though no longer in power, remained a steadfast figure. His commitment to peace and unity had earned him the title of the Protector, not because of his military strength, but because of his willingness to lead with humility. His legacy would not be defined by the length of his rule, but by the transformation he had brought to a nation on the brink of collapse. As the election day arrived, Ibrahim stood on the steps of the presidential palace one last time, watching the people line up to vote. In his heart, he knew the work was far from over. The insurgents had not disappeared, and challenges remained. But he also knew that Burkina Faso was no longer defined by fear or uncertainty. The dawn of a new era had begun. For Ibrahim Traoré, the protector of Burkina Faso, this was not the end, it was the beginning of a brighter future for his people, and in that knowledge he found peace.